A single generation after the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, the nation finds itself in what many historians call the Second War for American Independence, the War of 1812. It lasted from 1812 to 1815 and really established a few aspects of American um, approaches to warfare and nationhood, of the American ethos. It was America's first declared war. You may be surprised, Congress has officially declared war only 11 times and only in 5 wars: the War of 1812, Mexican American War, Spanish American War, World War I, and World War II. Some expect Korea to be on this list as the last of the declared wars, and we will get to that, but really Korea was a declaration under the UN and not under Congress. So these are the official declarations of war by Congress. We are now right around the 20-year mark for the longest single running military campaign in the nation's history. We're right around 20 years, and there's been no declaration of war, not since World War II. So, okay, back to 1812. America's first declared war, which really established the nation's sovereignty, as an internationally accepted part of the United States. The claims were like, why fight, right? So the claims, let's go back to the first one. The reason, the casus belli, the reason for fighting is that we weren't going back to the British Empire. The United States said, not going back, not going to be a semi-sovereign colonial outpost, not doing it. And also, it was really America's first expansionist war, which land grab. This was the first of many times that America would go to war for more or less the purpose of territorial acquisition. So let's get back over here. The claims that led to the war were that the British Empire, which was itself embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars at the time, tried to impress U.S. sailors into British service, and that's the picture on the right. And they would go and board U.S. ships, and pull the sailors in and put them to work for the British Navy. And the soldiers would claim American citizenship. Now, citizenship was a pretty uncertain category at this point. So people had papers. Often sailors marked their American citizenship with tattoos. So it wasn't always clear whether or not the British were in fact taking British citizens back into the British Navy, or if they were, kidnapping American sailors into the British Navy. But either way, it was a cause for war as far as the United States was concerned. Also, the British tried to govern U.S. trade relations with the rest of Europe, which means they policed their waters. They patrolled and policed the waters. They affected maritime rights. They would require the U.S. to stop over in Britain before trading with the rest of Europe and pay taxes on what it was that they had. And they took to arming Native Americans. The British took to arming those folks whom the Americans were expelling from their land left and right. They bought for themselves through armament, through treaties, through negotiations, through agreements, they bought for themselves an internal enemy as far as the United States was concerned. So, having declared, fought for, and won its independence just a couple decades previously in the Revolutionary War, America now had to show that it actually enjoyed independence, that it actually held that it had the power, that was associated with independence. So it was, the War of 1812 was, there were causes, but it was sort of a post-revolutionary insistence. We are independent, we are. And also, again, it was expansionist. We will see this continue. We tried to take Canada. We did not succeed. The British tried to take U.S. territory in August of 1814. They set fire to the White House, the U.S. Capitol building, really as much of D.C. as they could light a match to. So all of the main government buildings were burned, not all to the ground, but all pretty scorched. The British did not succeed in taking U.S. territory, but throughout they did develop important alliances with Native Americans, most notably Tecumseh and his Confederacy, and we will turn to this narrative, to this story, in the next unit. In terms of U.S.-British relations, the war was really a draw. It was a tie. We didn't get Canada. The Brits didn't get us back. in terms of suffering and loss of life, in terms of loss of land, loss of autonomy, Native American tribes bore the brunt of this war. They lost. They were, pretty disenfranchised, slaughtered, and moved. So the U.S. and the British ended the war by signing the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium on December 24th of 1814, but this is a world in which news travels very slowly by boat across oceans, right? And so what happened is December 24th, 1814, a treaty is signed and the war is ended, but that news didn't get to then Major General Andrew Jackson, pictured in your upper left in a really famous presentation of the Battle of New Orleans, when he led a ramshackle group of American soldiers, conscripts, volunteers, pirates, really anyone he could get his hands on, against a much larger, much more well-trained British force, and won in the Battle of New Orleans, pictured there. He won, and the fame and the glory of that victory really carried him to the White House in 1829. And as president, he signed the Indian Removal Act that led to the Trail of Tears and many other massive movements of folks from their traditional homelands, and he's gone down in this way as really conflicted. But what I want, before we get to his legacy, I'd like to look at this bottom right, the Indian Removal Act U.S. House roll call, right? So the congressional vote here was very close. This was a nation deeply divided, and there wasn't a clear consensus about what the new nation's relationship was to the traditional inhabitants of the land they claimed. You can see that most, not exclusively, but mostly the multiple yes votes came from regions directly impacted by the Indian Removal Act. They were right next to the land. They were going to get the land. They were looking at these folks directly, and they were having, not the best relationships with tribal communities who had already been squished into smaller places. And it's those folks who found it easier to vote for the Indian Removal Act, and most of your national body that voted against it were in fact people who were not being directly affected by it, who didn't see it. This isn't a justification. It is a tendency within us. Folks tend to vote along the lines of their most direct, most easily interpretable experience, and the government has had a hand in helping to shape the collective interpretation of experience. But this was not a clear, and there's green on the bottom and red on the top too. There's a bit of a mixing up going on here. This was a divided nation. So Andrew Jackson has gone down as both as a democratic man of the people, an emblem of what's come to be known as Jacksonian America's promise of upward mobility, of frontier independence, of all of a lot of what would become Manifest Destiny very soon, come to be known directly as Manifest Destiny. A lot of this deep American inclination towards pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps and whatnot. Some say he was the president who made America a real global power, that it was him from the War of 1812 through his presidency that really established America as a nation that had clout on the international stage. But he's also gone down as a genocidal anti-abolitionist, which he was. And there's been a great deal of argument over taking him off the currency. He can be seen in this way as metonymic for, or as like symbolic of, standing in for a real model for the American hero that we see throughout the history of the nation. Equal parts aspirational ideals, self-sacrifice for a more perfect union on a democratic model, right? And incomprehensibly, immeasurably corrupt, violent, indefensible inhumanity, right? Like so in the same person you see manifested both of these ideals. He did get the era named after him. Jacksonian America is a time of upward mobility. It was a false promise for many, many people, which we've now historically sort of come to see. But it helped to shape what became the American character that lives on to this day. I'd really like to see Lin-Manuel Miranda take this guy's story on. I think it would. So the Battle of New Orleans brought Jackson to prominence, and in the minds and in the consciousness of most Americans, the Battle of New Orleans, and not the Treaty of Ghent, which nobody really recognized or knew about, that's what ended the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans, and it did so in 1815. Um, a little over a year before the Battle of New Orleans was the Battle of Baltimore, September 1914. This battle, significant in its own right in terms of the war, it had a place in the Marshall narrative, gave to history the poem Defense of Fort McHenry, written by the lawyer Francis Scott Key, who watched the battle from a British truce ship on the Patapsco River. He got stuck there in the middle of a diplomatic mission. He happened to see the whole thing. He was a lawyer and also an amateur poet. So he sets this scene down in the poem, and the poem gets set to music. It gets renamed the Star Spangled Banner, and in 1931, later than a lot of folks I think would imagine, it's declared by Congress to be the national anthem of the United States. You've read the full poem, only the first verse of which is ever sung. Probably most of you hadn't seen the following verses, and you've read Mark Clegg's brief article on Colin Kaepernick's protest and on Francis Scott Key's historical context. So a couple points I want to highlight from Clegg, which indicate why Kaepernick is such a socially important and influential figure from recent history. Clegg reminds us that the anthem is, quote, a living historic performance, a vehicle for social comment, and that it shares its conceptual DNA with the United States as a whole. Which means that the ideals that it espouses of freedom and bravery, of redemptive violence and American exceptionalism, those ideals were brought up from a ground laced with injustice, with racism, and with the abuses of the powerful. The role of the anthem in American experience illustrates its centrality to the American mythos. It's become part of the ritual performance of American identity, as you saw in the Super Bowl videos, right? That ritual, which is ostensibly not religious, although on a side note, the rituals of American civil religion have been recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States as religious, thanks to, and therefore non-compulsory, thanks to the Jehovah's Witnesses, who took the flag salute to the Supreme Court on First Amendment grounds. So, but the ritual of the national anthem, which many would still to this day tell you is the common knowledge is that it's not religious, right? It's not religious, though the Supreme Court has agreed that, in fact, these rituals are religious. But that ritual calls upon people to sort of stand reverently, hand over their heart, gazing at the flag, which is itself the subject of the song. It's meant to be a kind of ritual performance of American virtue. And I'm grateful for Clegg's historical contextualization. I think that's important. But I'd like to suggest, I think we can see the ways in which Kaepernick's taking a knee, rather than standing reverentially for the anthem, has less to do with the language of the middle verses of Key's poem, which, again, the vast majority of Americans just don't know, right? It has less to do with the question of whether or not the anthem itself is racist. That's kind of a literary interpretive, historical contextualization project. The protest has far more to do with the symbolic or mythic weight of the song and its public performance. Through their ritual behavior, the audience, signals their appreciation for the symbolic gravity of the song, as well as their adherence to the national culture that the song symbolizes, right? That national culture, the contemporary societal norms of any given time, those change. We see that throughout history. And they've changed a great deal since the Star Spangled Banner was adopted by the U.S. Navy in 1889, and then since Congress adopted it in 1931. It's a national culture that holds up these ideals, these mythic virtues, and constantly reinterprets what living according to those virtues might look like. So the virtues that we've seen from before the Revolutionary period and now kind of further, articulated through the War of 1812, these are virtues that continue through our national culture, most often unrecognized, but that we do persistently hold up and periodically hold up, in our better moments hold up and say, what does it look like to live according to these ideals? And that has changed through history. What Kaepernick and others have non-violently argued is that in 21st century America, not everyone of the we the people enjoy the blessings of liberty, right? The American promise is not being met, and that promise is too self-evidently good, let's look at Kaepernick, to let go of. right? For some, the ritual of the anthem is simply it's just too sacred to be the site of social dissent, to be the arena, the arena or the event that inspires a national conversation in this way. Some folks see this as a sacred moment of great mythic import or national virtue, that it's not appropriate. Social dissent is not appropriate in this context. For others, it's cultural centrality, its visibility, and it's often unrecognized sacrality or sacredness make it the perfect site for such dissent. Like, this is where we talk about our ideals when we are standing up and proclaiming them, right? As a mythic point, it's a point on which reasonable people might disagree whether or not this is the space for dissent. But wherever you fall out on that, I invite you to read or to hear those last two lines of the first verse that is sung as part of our national anthem, as not being about the presence or absence of the flag, right? But about but rather as being a question about the historically developing character of America as a national culture. The question isn't, is the flag still there, right? The flag is there. The question then is this truly the land of the free and the home of the brave? Do we live into that? Do we manifest that, right? And if it's not, then the question is, what might we do to make it so, to more closely approximate the virtues which we proclaim? Now, last time we talked about the war of the Revolutionary War, the War for American Independence, and we kind of came to the notion that American freedom, as it's developed there, as it's defined there, is defined as existing insofar as it does in the tension between liberty and security, right? That's the conversation. It's a big conversation point, a hotspot of conversation that's going to continue through American cultural self-understanding. But that's not what the national anthem, peaceful protests were engaging. That question isn't present to this, because that claim that the balancing of liberty and security, that balancing act itself creates an opportunity for freedom, for shared freedom, assumes that you're balancing a shared sense of liberty against a shared sense of security, that you can authentically engage in this conversation because you have a united national body whose liberty and whose security you can discourse about, right? And what's happening here, what Kaepernick and others have pointed to, and not just in football and not just in professional football, we've got high school at the bottom right, it also moves into all manner of other sports and venues, but what they're highlighting here is that the America of today, the divided and racially unjust America of today doesn't offer liberty or security to people of color, not on any kind of regular or expected basis. That liberty and that security is severely limited and sometimes just completely curtailed, cut off by unfathomable acts of violence. So in that context, what's happening here, we don't even get to the point where we can have this very important, authentic conversation about American freedom. We're not there because we don't have a shared sense of liberty or security, right? That's to be fixed first. And so what we're actually arguing over here is public piety, is the ways in which symbolic gestures manifest our mythos. And in this way, it occurs to me that that this protest that we're looking at and the America ripped apart by riots of today is, in some ways manifests a little bit more of the War of 1812 than it does the War for American Independence. That the conversation that was actively at play during the Revolutionary War is sidelined during the War of 1812. And that war becomes a conversation rather about asserting a kind of dominance, expanding, and it's also during the War of 1812 that Uncle Sam is invented, right? He doesn't take the form of "we want you" that you have grown accustomed to until later, and we'll look at that in a few units, but Uncle Sam comes about during the War of 1812 when the American national body really just wanted to expand territory and power. That's what That's what the America and an assurance of keeping the independence, of becoming a settled status quo. And then we draw up these mythic figures. I would like to see an America that is able to directly encounter questions of liberty and security for all of its people. In order to aspire to a more perfect union, liberty and security have to be secured for all, so that the conversation about what constitutes freedom might be meaningful, might be able to be had in an authentic manner. Next, we will turn to the American Indian Wars, and as we will see, that is also a challenging and difficult era to face, and very long era to face in the American history. So again, I encourage us all to maintain our hopefulness and recognize that we will see that there continue to be points of real excellence in our national history, points of real inspiration, and of the peaceful changing of the status quo into something approximating a greater sense of justice, approximating a greater sense of living into a greater sense of the land of the free and the home of the brave.